stretch. And all of a sudden you look around and you got nothing. I mean, the Twins after the 91 season, Kansas City Royals, there's any number. Look at the Angels. I really felt like the California Angels were on the verge of back in 2010, 11, 12, and even with Mike Trout and then getting Pujols. I mean, I really thought they were on the verge of being one of the really great, what a Cleveland, Boston, Houston type of team. And they just haven't, they haven't gotten there. And it's very hard. There are so many aspects to sustaining good play. And you look at the Twins in 2010, for example, and they were right there. They were short in starting pitching, but they were right there. And in a matter of, 18 months, Maurer went down, Morneau went down, Thome went down. The team got a little bit old before anybody suspected that was happening, and at the same time, the draft picks that they had made, didn't over the previous 5 years didn't supply them with anybody coming up, and it wasn't obvious as it was happening, and so that's the way it happens with all of these clubs, and it happened with Kansas City. I mean, how do you have the George Brett, Amos Otis, Hal McRae teams, and then all of a sudden you're like Houston was, for a few years, just terrible, just a doormat of the league. I mean, how does that happen? Well, team after team after team, it happens a lot. It's very easy to happen, and I think the Twins ought not to be faulted for not spending $300 million on a payroll to overcome things that happened in the past. I think they're building it back the right way.
I do remember around 2011 saying, Mauer's starting to show some signs of physical wear. And, you looked at, it was Blackburn, Slowey, Scott Baker. It was those kinds of guys. They were middle of the rotation right-handers without dominant stuff, and there was nothing behind them. And I remember looking at that and saying, when this goes south, it's going to go way. In fact, I remember talking to a Twins executive at that time, and that Twins executive was saying, I can't say it publicly, but you're right. We're going to go down, and we're dealing with a generation of fans who is, there was the Twins became kind of fun and trendy in 2001. And then they won for 10 straight years. And then they opened the ballpark, and a lot of people who weren't necessarily diehard baseball fans, but just loved Target Field and loved watching the Twins win, started going to games. And when it hit, you had a generation of baseball fans who really did not want to hear that sometimes you don't win.
Yeah, well, really true. And going back before they opened the new ballpark, with about 2 years left to go, by 2008. I was looking at that staff saying they've got so much invested in these guys, the guys you just mentioned, taking the next step and becoming more like a bunch of 1 and 2 starters, not 3, 4, and 5 guys. And that never happened. And I remember looking and thinking, I don't think it's going to happen. And I was really in favor at the time. I remember there was a time when. And I don't know what the deal would have been. This is crazy for me to say because I don't know what the deal would have been. But there was a pretty strong rumor when Adrian Beltre was still in Seattle, and Seattle was interested in Kevin Slowey, and I don't know who else would have had to have been thrown into the deal if anybody. But Beltre had not had great years in Seattle, just good. Not the way he played in Texas, but he had been a terrific player, and I always admired that man. And I thought, man, if that's really true, if there's anything like Slowey and somebody for Adrian Beltre, they got to make that deal because, just for the reasons that we're talking about, and because they didn't have a third baseman for a long time, and they stuck with, they were at that point in time. It appeared that they were afraid to give up on those kids that they really thought they were going to take the next step. And that's the kind of thing I was talking about earlier. That decision right there, and it wasn't an awful decision. It just turned out to be the wrong one. And I mean, up front, you don't know a priori if they're right or wrong. It's a judgment call. And their judgment was that they were going to take the next step with these pitchers, and it just didn't happen. And when it didn't, it really wiped them out for a while. They couldn't pitch for a long time.
Yeah, they had, and they went from being a kind of a model franchise to having Morneau's concussion alter his career, Mauer's whatever stuff in 2011 alter his career, and then no pitching for years,
right.
and they went right off the cliff. And I'll also go ahead.
All I was going to say is all those things are examples of what happened to ball clubs, and you can't tell on an a priori basis that the decisions, you can't look at that and say that's going to turn out to be really stupid. People don't make, the decisions don't turn out to be stupid until later.
Yeah. And I will also always give credit to Dan Gladden, baseball genius, who was telling me around that time, he was telling me they need to get Adrian Beltre. I'm like, okay, Beltre's a nice player. And really, Beltre was famous around that time for having signed a huge deal with the Dodgers. He had signed a huge deal that was impossible to live up to. And that that obscured the fact that he was a great ball player and a great guy and a great leader at a very difficult position to fill. And Gladden was telling me way back then, hey, they need to go get Beltre. And man, was he right about that.
He was absolutely right. And what convinced me was at some point in time, we were out in Seattle. I was out in Seattle with the ball club, and Don Baylor was the hitting coach out there. And I'm standing around the batting cage early, watching, talking with Groove and watching the Mariner hitters hit. And Beltre was walking out of the dugout, and Baylor called him over, said, "Hey, come here," and said, "I want you two guys to meet." And he introduced me to Beltre, and he looked at me and he said, "This guy's one of the best guys there is in baseball." And Baylor loved him, and Beltre was not living up to the contract. He had a huge year in with the Dodgers, signed a big contract in Seattle in a big cold ballpark, and for whatever reason didn't hit the same number of home runs. He wasn't a 30 home run guy in Seattle. Got to Texas, and it made all the difference, and everybody saw what kind of player he was. But I always thought he was a terrific player, and when Don Baylor gives that kind of endorsement, which didn't happen very often, I have liked and admired Beltre ever since.
Yeah, and I know people who've covered him say he's just the greatest, who really rave about him as a human being as well. Next week, next week we're going to talk about some of the proposed rules changes. Roy and I have been suggesting a lot of changes to baseball rules over the years, and baseball is finally catching up with our thinking, and we appreciate it. We will talk about that. We also talk about the Twins signing Bryce Harper, because I'm sure that's about to happen. Do want to thank Barry Coffee, BarryCoffee.com, and Tony Hoagland, Hoaglund, your State Farm agent in Champlin. Again, thanks to Brandon Morton, our producer. If you'd like to advertise with us, you can reach us at talknorthpodcast@gmail.com. Download before you listen. Follow us at Talk North Pod on Twitter. Do you have a final thought for us, Roy?
I think people are tired of all the thoughts that I've rambled on about today. We'll have more next week.
Yeah, but no, great stuff on Frank Robinson. Again, one of the few professional athletes I can say I actually idolized at a point in my life, and of course once I became a baseball writer, I realized I picked one of the right guys.
Yeah, you couldn't have had a better athlete as an idol, no question.
Yeah, oh yeah, what condition, my condition.